So, as we all know, the Lakers are bad, like really, really bad. And what's even more concerning is what this means for their future. Because if you didn't know, the Lakers have actually moved a lot of pieces to put themselves in the situation. And quite frankly, this year they have been severely underwhelming. And if that wasn't a hard enough pill to swallow, when you look across the league and look at some of the young pieces that the Lakers moved to put themselves in the situation, a lot of them have been performing really well. Which then warrants the question, was all of this really worth it? For an organization to leverage their entire future for just one successful season, there's definitely some credibility to that question. So in today's video, we're going to figure out what happened to all the young Laker players, how good have they turned out to be, and was it actually worth the Lakers trading those pieces away? First, we start with Julius Randle. Randle was a 7th overall pick in the 2014 draft class and had real expectations to be a star caliber power forward in the NBA. Unfortunately, we wouldn't see that in his rookie year because in his NBA debut, he ended up breaking his leg, which had him sidelined for the remainder of the year. In his sophomore season, which really was his pseudo-rookie year, Randle actually showed a lot of promise, but it was clear that it was going to be an uphill battle. Finishing that season averaging a double-double, but had some clear limitations on his scoring ability. He improved as a scorer for the next 2 years, but it became unbearably obvious that he was going to be a hard fit for any roster surrounding him due to his lack of three-point shooting, as well as him not being a reliable defender. Those two factors, as well as the Lakers looking for some cap space flexibility, played major roles in why Los Angeles let Randle just walk in free agency during the summer of 2018. So, what happened next? Well, during the summer of 2018, remember, this is the same offseason that the Lakers were able to acquire LeBron. And around the same time is when they renounced Randle, making him an unrestricted free agent, which then allowed him to sign a 2-year, $18 million contract with the New Orleans Pelicans, with his second year being a player option. And this is when Randle's career really started to take off. In the beginning of the following season, Randle was coming off the bench as, again, it was really hard to find a role for him in any starting lineup. However, once Anthony Davis was sidelined for whatever reason he was sidelined for during that year, Randle as a starter really started to pick up his production. In the last 49 games that Randle played during the 2018-2019 season, of which 45 of them he started, he averaged 23 points, 8.5 rebounds, 3 assists, nearly a steal and a block, while shooting roughly 52% from the field and 36% from 3. Randle would then go into the offseason, decline his player option, and pick up a 3-year, $63 million contract with the New York Knicks and continue to grow as a starting caliber power forward in the NBA. His first year as a Knick was a bit rocky, but the second one is when he had a career year, ending the season averaging 24 points, 10 rebounds, 6 assists with a steal, with shooting splits of 45, 41, and 81, the most noteworthy one being that Randle was shooting above 40% from deep on 5 attempts per game. Actually, this production was so impressive that Randle was not only deemed an All-Star, but also made an All-NBA team, while also leading the Knicks to their first postseason appearance in nearly a decade. However, that's where things really started to fall apart. In the first round against the Atlanta Hawks, Julius Randle had one of the worst series I've ever seen in my entire life from a star caliber player, as he was held to 18 points, nearly averaged 5 turnovers a game, and the shooting splits were just abysmal, shooting below 30% from the field and 33% from deep. But his regular season campaign was still good enough to convince the Knicks to give him a 4-year, $117 million contract extension, and honestly, so far this season, he isn't living up to that contract whatsoever. And I would go as far as to say that Julius Randle is underperforming so much so that he is quickly becoming one of the most overpaid players in the NBA. So, that's what Randle's been up to. Up next, and I will be brief with this, we have Jordan Clarkson. Clarkson is a 6'4" shooting guard who was actually drafted by the Washington Wizards but traded to the Lakers on draft night for money. Yes, good old cash consideration. Now quickly, Clarkson proved that he was going to be a quality NBA player as he instantly developed into a scoring punch within limited minutes, and even though some of those points might not have been the most efficient, you can't really ask that much more from a young player who was selected with a second-round pick. Because of his development, optimism, and the Lakers swinging and missing on everyone during the 2016 offseason, he earned himself a 4-year, $50 million contract. But unfortunately after that, the 24-year-old guard's development started to plateau, so much so that the Lakers deemed it necessary to trade him at the beginning of the 2017-2018 year. And oh yes, another big reason why the Lakers wanted to move off of Clarkson was because of his contract, so they can receive some cap flexibility, because they believed during the 2018 offseason that they had the ability to acquire not only LeBron James, but also Paul George. Because of that belief, the Lakers received 2 expiring contracts in Isaiah Thomas and Channing Frye, and then after that, more or less, Jordan Clarkson stayed the same. a really good scoring option coming off the bench, who might not have been the most efficient, but definitely added some depth to a roster that desperately needed it. Speaking of which, fast forward to the 2019-2020 season when Clarkson was traded once more to the Utah Jazz, and it seemed as if Utah is a perfect situation for him. Utah's an organization that from time to time overly depends on Donovan Mitchell's scoring prowess and definitely needed to give him some help coming off the bench, which is what he's been able to provide. So much so that Clarkson was actually named Sixth Man of the Year during the 2020-2021 season. Up next, we have D'Angelo Russell. Russell was drafted with the second overall pick in the 2015 draft, and he entered the league with very high expectations, drawing comparisons to Penny Hardaway and Brandon Roy thanks to his canny ability to be a volume scorer, but also the potential of being a competent facilitator as well. Unfortunately, those projections were a bit too high, as the lack of athleticism made it an uphill battle for Russell to be a consistent scorer, and with there being a potential cap on his scoring ability, there certainly was going to be a limitation when it comes to his facilitation. Because Russell was a bigger project than expected, this was the Lakers wanting to get off of Mozgov's horrendous contract, and LA drafting potentially the replacement for Russell and Lonzo, and oh yes, let me not forget some of the off-court shenanigans that resulted in Russell losing all the trust within the Lakers front office and locker room. The 20-year-old guard was traded to the Brooklyn Nets, and in return, LA received Brook Lopez, who was on an expiring contract, and Kyle Kuzma. So, what happened to D'Lo? Well, in his first year in Brooklyn, his struggles continued. However, his second year as a Net is when he had his breakout season, finishing the 2018-2019 season averaging 21 points, 7 assists, 4 rebounds on much more respectable shooting splits, but more importantly, he led Brooklyn to their first winning season in 5 years, which translated to a playoff appearance, and for his efforts, he was awarded an All-Star appearance. But then after that, it's been a lot of noise. After his All-Star campaign, he was shipped off to the Golden State Warriors via the Kevin Durant trade, and after just 33 games as a Warrior, he was shipped off to the Minnesota Timberwolves via the Andrew Wiggins trade, and that's kind of where we are now. Once Russell touched down in Minnesota, a lot of people were optimistic about what a duo of D'Lo and Towns could look like, especially since they already had a previous relationship and the expectations in Minnesota was going to be at an all-time low, but unfortunately, it never really has manifested itself into something of significance. Now, one could easily argue the biggest reason for that has to do with injuries and COVID protocol, but even as we speak right now, it certainly feels like a bigger reason why Minnesota has seen a lot of success it has seen so far this season has way more to do with a duo of Towns and Edwards rather than Towns and D'Lo. Moving on to Brandon Ingram, who was selected with the second overall pick in the 2016 draft, and similar to D'Lo, he had very lofty expectations entering the league, drawing comparisons to Kevin Durant thanks to his frame and his knack of scoring. Unfortunately, similar to D'Lo, the project of building Ingram into a reliable volume scorer in the league was a bit more daunting than originally expected. His first year in the NBA, he was held under double digits in terms of his scoring average, and even though there were noteworthy improvements in his second season, there were still several holes in his game that warranted any adjustments in anyone's expectations with the young forward. In his third year in the NBA, the growth was stagnant. However, one could easily argue him playing alongside LeBron James wasn't the best fit, and the only reason why I would entertain that argument is because in the last 30 games that Ingram played that year, he's a 20-point scorer, grabbing 6 rebounds, 3.5 assists, while converting over 50% of his shots and 70% of his free throws. Now, unfortunately, that production was short-lived because Ingram was diagnosed with a blood clot. However, it would still be hard for someone to be optimistic with Ingram staying with the Lakers, because if he's not able to produce those numbers while playing alongside LeBron James, then what exactly is the point? So during the 2019 offseason, Ingram, as well as a few other players and a slew of draft assets, were traded to the Pelicans, and in return, the Lakers received Anthony Davis. And since then, Ingram has actually been really good. He's consistently averaged around 22 to 24 points on shooting splits. That has been noticeable improvement since his years as a Laker, and the volume is there as well for someone to claim that he is a reliable scorer. And with his jump in scoring production, his improvements as a facilitator is there as well, and I would go as far as to argue that B.I. has legitimate potential to be a perennial all-star, and maybe some years in his career to perform at an all-NBA level as well. Up next, we have Lonzo Ball, and similar to Ingram and D'Lo, Lonzo was drafted with the second overall pick entered the NBA with very lofty expectations, and unfortunately, he missed the mark severely within his time in LA, as he struggled immensely with his three-point shot, lacking the confidence to be a competent driver to the basket, and due to his wonky shooting form, couldn't create his own shot consistently. And even when there were glimpses of progression, they were short-lived due to injuries. So when the Lakers cut ties with a young guard via the Anthony Davis trade, many people thought that LA wasn't going to be missing much. So what's happened since? Ball immediately grew as a three-point shooter, as he was converting nearly 38% of his three-pointers in his first year in New Orleans, and with him playing alongside Jrue Holiday, his defensive intangibles started to be highlighted even further. Pairing that with the feel of the game that he's always had that made him a really great passer, and you can slowly start to see where some of that hype was based in early on in his career. Furthermore, if you were someone who's a bit skeptical on the legitimacy of Lonzo's three-point shooting, well, in the following season, he continued to shoot roughly 38% from deep on higher volume. Because of the growth, the value of Lonzo increased so much so that the Pelicans decided to cut ties with him once he was an unrestricted free agent, as the Bulls signed him to a 4-year, $80 million contract. And in Chicago, the improvements continued with the young guard. So much so that not only is he shooting above 40% from deep this season, but if he had stayed healthy throughout the entire year, he would have made a legitimate argument to make an all-defensive team. And as a quick side note, because I'm not going to give him his own segment, you can say the same thing about Caruso, who was another player that the Lakers let walk in free agency because they were trying to free up cap space for a star caliber player who is now in Chicago and performing at all defensive team levels. And then finally, we have Kyle Kuzma. Kuzma made his way to the Lakers via the D'Angelo Russell trade, and with him being a late first-round pick, the expectations weren't that high at all, but during his rookie campaign, he surprised many people, as he finished his first year in the NBA averaging 16 points, 6 rebounds, nearly 2 assists, and shooting splits that were so respectable that it resulted in nearly league average efficiency. In his sophomore campaign, the production was relatively the same with a slight dip in efficiency, but honestly, that might have been reasonable. Not only could Kuzma have been dealing with his sophomore slump, but also with that being the first year playing alongside LeBron James, there's a learning curve that comes along with that, and again, all understandable. So when it was time for the Lakers to piece together a trade package to go after Anthony Davis, it actually made a lot of sense for them to try their hardest to retain Kuzma, which is exactly what they did. And now with him playing a more complementary role in the offense, one would expect that if the production drops, possibly the efficiency will go back up to where it once was. But unfortunately, that just didn't happen at all. In his third year, his minutes, role, and even his position as a starter all changed, and I honestly believe that is a fair explanation for the drop in production and further drop in efficiency that we saw from him during that season. In the following season, the production was relatively the same, so when it was time for the Lakers to go after another star to piece alongside AD and LeBron, Kuzma's name was constantly on the chopping block. So it didn't come to a surprise at all when he was traded alongside KCP and Montrezl Harrell to the Washington Wizards for Russell Westbrook. And so far, what has he been doing this season? Honestly, he's been playing really well. His numbers across the board are more similar to what we saw from him in the beginning of his career rather in the latter parts of his years in LA. And to be more specific, in the last 30 games, Kuzma is essentially averaging 22 points, 9 rebounds, 4 assists, while shooting 48% from the field, 37% from 3, and 75% from the free throw line. So yeah, that's a lot of talent. And for the people out there who believe that I might be dragging it a bit by bringing in players like Julius Randle and D'Angelo Russell, please hear me out. It's very important that we understand the full scope of this so you thoroughly understand what all the Lakers did to position themselves to receive everyone that they needed to build a championship caliber roster. And once you're able to have that type of perspective on what exactly occurred, I do believe the question of was it all worth it becomes very valid. On one hand, you can argue that a team should do anything in their power to put themselves in a situation to win a championship. And the fact that the Lakers were able to get that job done further promotes the concept that it actually was worth it. However, it can also be true that the way that the Lakers built their championship roster shows signs of incompetency. Because instead of understanding the nuances of what it truly takes to build a championship caliber roster, what the Lakers have done is put all of that to the side just to acquire as many stars as possible. And even on the surface, that may sound like a great idea, especially because, you know, teams need stars to win championships. But if that is the only way that you've been able to piece together a successful roster in nearly a 10-year span, I do believe that shows how incompetent the front office is. And when you're that incompetent, sure, you may be able to ring off 1 or 2 really good years, especially when you have so many assets that it's nearly impossible for you to fail. But in the long run, you're going to do way more bad than good. Freeing up that much cap space for the summer of 2018 by trading Jordan Clarkson, D'Angelo Russell, and letting Brook Lopez and Julius Randle just walk in free agency just for the Lakers to receive one max contract was a massive mistake. And no, I'm not saying that Julius Randle would have been a big difference maker for this team, but what I'm saying is if you're the Lakers and you have Randle when it's time to trade for AD, maybe you don't have to move as many draft picks, or maybe you don't have to trade Lonzo. You can keep the point of attack defender who's also an excellent three-point shooter on your roster instead of having to cross your fingers and hoping you can get that same level of production out of Austin Reeves. So in short, there are more efficient ways of building a championship caliber roster instead of just trading and moving all of the young players and assets that you have on your team. And if the front office is unable to identify with that, then all I have to ask is, what happens when you don't have any more young players and assets for the next several years? Or better yet, what happens if the Lakers go back to being irrelevant and no stars would ever want to sign with them? Which is a very similar situation that the Lakers found themselves in right before LeBron signed to the team. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Please let me know what you think about the video in the comment section below. We're at the end of the regular season, so a lot of heat will be dropping on this channel. Also, I have another basketball channel. Make sure you go check that out. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.